Okay, 1 second. Okay. Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We are in the book of Yehoshua, and tonight I want to do chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to go through these 4 chapters, and then we're going to come back to one particular incident, and we'll spend the rest of the class discussing it. And that is when Yehoshua stops the sun and the moon. And we're going to discuss it at great length. But first, we're going to go through these 4 chapters, and then we'll come back to it. So chapter 9, most of it is involved with one particular incident. And that is, chapter 9 begins with saying that the kings of Canaan, seeing that Israel is starting to conquer the land, so they all came together in order to fight Israel. And then it tells the story of the Givonim. They were from a place called Givon, and today there is a place called Givon, and it seems to be very, very near the historical Givon of the book of Yehoshua. And so what they did is they understood that Israel was in the process of conquering the land, and they came up with this plan. And what they did is they sent a delegation, and chapter 9 goes into great detail how they pulled off this ruse, this plan, where they put on like old tattered clothes. They had this bread that was like old and like very hard, and they put like dust on their shoes to make it appear that they were coming from a long distance. And this delegation comes to Yehoshua and the princes, the elders, and says that we have heard all about you and the God of Israel and the miracles that God has been doing for you. Make a covenant with us. We want to be in an alliance with you. Make a covenant with us. And so Yehoshua and everyone seemed like a very strange story here. And they're like, well, Yehoshua said, well, where are you from? And they said, a very, very far place. And so the question is, so why do you want to make a covenant with us? Like, what's in it for you? And they said, basically, we have heard about your God, and we we want to join with you. So the whole chapter goes through this idea. And at a certain point, Yehoshua agrees. And they make a covenant with them, meaning that, we won't harm you and you'll be like in alliance with us. And the princes all made a oath about this covenant. And then 3 days later, they came to realize that this was a whole fake news, that they were actually from the place called Givon, which was in line for Israel to conquer. And so the people were very upset. But the princes came and said, like, okay, we made a mistake, but we made an oath. And we can't pretend that we didn't make this oath. And it's not a positive thing to renege on your promises. So the question is, well, what would be done with these people? And now they realize that this delegation was just a delegation from this whole city called Givon. And so in the end, the strategy was that they would become the woodcutters and the water carriers of Israel. In other words, they fooled Israel, but Israel didn't want to renege on its promise. And when they confronted them, the Givonim were, at that point, they were honest. And they said, we see you're going to conquer Israel. And we don't really object to that, but if we would have fought against you, you would have killed us all. And we came up with this plan in order to save our lives. And we have do your thing, conquer the land. We're not going to stop you, but we didn't want to get decimated in the process. So they became the water carriers and the wood choppers for Israel. Now, it's interesting because in the book of Devarim, in Parshat Nitzavim, so Parshat Nitzavim begins, you are standing today, all of you, before Hashem, your God. And then it lists 10 different segments of Am Yisrael. And it's actually, there are 10 segments. And according to Kabbalah and Hasidut, it's according to the Sfirot. And it's all inclusive. It's the men, the women, the children, the leaders, everything. So it's in chapter 29, verse 9 of Devarim. And it goes through these 10 parts of Am Yisrael. So it says, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Hashem Elokechem. You are all standing before God. Then it says, Roshechem, your leaders, Shivtechem, your tribes, Ziknechem, your elders, Vishotrechem, your enforcers of law, Kol Ish Yisrael, all of Israel, Tapchem, your children, Nashechem, all the women, Begercha Asher B'Kerev Machanecha, and all the converts, Mechotev Eitzecha Ad Shoev Mimecha, from those who chop wood to those who carry water. So it's interesting that here in the book of Devarim, this was given over not that long before this whole incident with the Givonim, because this Parshat Nitzavim is at the end of the 40 years in the desert. It's in the last days of Moshe's life. And here in Yehoshua, we're somewhere around 6 months after this. And so Yehoshua makes them the water carriers and the woodcutters, meaning we will have an alliance with you, but you're going to be subservient to us because you fooled us. But that's what the situation will be. So the question is, why did Yehoshua accept them in the first place? And one of the reasons given was because they said, we've heard about your God and we see he's done miracles for you. And we want to be part of you. So Yehoshua had a hope that they were sincere and they would convert. Because remember, they're coming into Eretz Yisrael. They've already gone to Har Grizim and Har Eval and set up these huge stones where they wrote out the whole Torah in 70 languages. The idea being that the Torah is for everyone. Ultimately, it's for everyone. So Yehoshua was hoping that they were expressing a desire to truly be part of Israel. And that's why he accepted them. So that's the main idea of chapter 9. Chapter 10 begins where 5 kings come together and they are preparing to, defend the land. And they are particularly upset with the Givonim because instead of the Givonim joining these kings to fight Israel, the Givonim are like in alliance with Israel. They're not going to fight against Israel. And so these 5 kings come against Givon. And the Givonim send word to Yehoshua and more or less saying, like, we're in alliance with you. Please come and defend us. And so that's what Yehoshua did. The whole army went and they defended Givon. They were successful. And in chapter 10, it explains how they chased these 5 kings and their armies. And from Givon, they chased him to Mavo Choron, to Beit Choron. And today, there is a place called Givon, and not far from it is a place called Beit Choron. And these are very, very likely in approximately the exact same places that they were. And we know that because Beit Choron is described in other places in the Talmud, that there's a very steep incline coming from what's called the Shvela, Tel Aviv, Herzliya, Netanya, Haifa. They're all in what's called the Shvela, the flat area right next to the Mediterranean. And then it becomes hilly, and then it becomes mountainous. And Beit Choron was towards the top of this very, very steep incline. Now, what's interesting is that there are two main ways to get to Jerusalem today. One is called Highway 1, which goes from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the second way is called Highway 443, which also goes from more or less Tel Aviv. It actually branches off of Highway 1, and it goes right past where I live. And when I go to Yerushalayim, I go on Highway 443, and this is actually the ancient way of getting to Jerusalem, not Highway 1, it's Highway 443, was the more ancient way. And that is from where I live, whereas it's a bit hilly, but around 5 to 6 kilometers from here, a very steep incline begins going all the ways up to Jerusalem. And towards the top is Beit Horon. So that's what happened here. From Givon, they successfully protected the people of Givon, and they chased them to Beit Horon. In Beit Horon, a miracle occurred, and huge hailstones came from heaven and fell on these armies that Israel was chasing, not on Israel, but on the armies. And it was considered very miraculous. And then they continued to chase them. And I'm in chapter 10 now, verse 12 through 14. And this is a section, I'm going to read it now, and then we're going to continue through chapter 10, 11, and 12, and we're going to come back, because this is a very, very famous incident, and there's a lot to talk about. So it says, Az yidaber Yehoshua l'Hashem bayom tet Hashem et emori lifnei b'nei Yisrael. So then Yehoshua spoke to God on the day that God was giving over the nation of the Emori before Bnei Yisrael. V'yomer le'enei Yisrael. And so Yehoshua said in the eyes of all of Israel, Shemesh begivon dom, the sun should literally be silent in Givon, v'yareach be'emek Ayalon, and the moon should and the moon in the valley of Ayalon. The valley of Ayalon still exists. It's at the bottom of this steep incline. For those who know Israel, that's where Kibbutz Shalavim is. Vayadom Hashemesh, and the sun was silent. V'yareach amad, and the moon stood still. Ad yikom goy oivev, until Israel was able to fight against the enemy nation. Halohi Halohi ktuva al sefer hayeshar, and this is written in the book of, it's called the Sefer Yeshar, the straight book, the book of straightness. V'yamod hashemesh b'chetzi hashemayim, and the sun stood in the middle of the heaven. V'lo atz lavo k'yom tamim, and it didn't move for a complete day. V'lo haya k'yom hahu lefanav ve'acharav, and there was no day like this before it or after it. Lishmoa Hashem b'kol ish, that God listened to the voice of a person. Ki Hashem nilcham l'Yisrael, because God fought for Israel. That is these few sentences. Now, obviously, most people have heard of this idea that Yehoshua was commanded the sun to be quiet, literally to stand still, but the words are to be quiet, and the moon to stand still for an entire day until they could finish the war. And there was no day like this in all of history, before or after. Whatever happened then, and we'll try to explain it, it never happened before or after. We will come back to discuss this. So what happens during that day that the sun and the moon stopped? So Yehoshua and all of the army was able to pursue these 5 kings and to completely defeat them. And these 5 kings escaped, and they were found in a cave. And so Yehoshua commanded that they put big stones in front of this cave so they couldn't escape. And they continued with the war. After they had totally defeated the armies of the 5 kings, so they went back to this cave and they brought the kings to Yehoshua. And Yehoshua, this is all in chapter 10. So Yehoshua did a very symbolic thing. He told the, I'm not I have to see exactly who it was, but he commanded them to put their feet on the necks of the kings. In other words, the kings are on the ground, and symbolically, they put their feet on their necks. And Yehoshua said, just like these 5 kings are under our feet right now, so will all the rest of the kings of Canaan be defeated in this way. And Yehoshua proceeded to have the 5 kings killed, and they were put back into this cave. And it says, until this day, the kings symbolically are in this cave. I'm sure their bodies, no longer exist, but they were put back in this cave, and that's where they stayed. And then chapter 10 continues with a whole series of different nations or kingships that Israel was defeating. And so there's a whole list of passages that we fought against this king, and then this king, and then this king, and it names the different places. And most of them were what we would call now the south of Israel and the middle of Israel. That's where the fighting was going on in chapter 10. Chapter 11, then God commands Yehoshua to turn towards the north. And here, a whole number of places up north are mentioned. One of them is Sidon. Now, Sidon today is in Lebanon. So it's important to know is that in ancient times, half of what we call Lebanon now was part of the inheritance of Eretz Yisrael. And so Yehoshua fought all the ways up to Sidon. Then it's mentioned about Mount Hermon. And that's where the Golan Heights is today. And we know already that the 2.5 tribes that wanted to settle on the east of the Jordan, so they had already inherited what we call the Golan Heights and a good part of Syria and a good part of Jordan. That's when Moshe and Israel in the book of Devarim fight against Sichon and Og. And they defeated both of them. And that's when the 2.5 tribes requested from Moshe, we want to stay here. It's like a good pasture land. And they had many, many, many flocks, these tribes, and many flocks, and they wanted to settle there. And so these names are mentioned. And then what's interesting, in the 11th chapter, it says, now it turns our attention back to the south. 1 second, the video is... there. Back to the south, and it mentions specifically that Yehoshua at that point had not conquered Gaza, Ashdod, and Gat. And Gaza is the same Gaza as today. Ashdod is more or less where the city of Ashdod in Israel is today. And Gat is today is the city called Kiryat Gat, also in the same area. And it mentions in the 11th chapter that Yehoshua had not conquered those areas yet. And then most of the 11th chapter is going through these different wars, and how Yehoshua is fighting against them. Then we get to chapter 12. And here we have something very, very interesting, is that, again, it continues with different areas that Yehoshua is conquering. And then it gives a list of 31 kings that Yehoshua fought against and defeated. And so here we have to have an explanation, because, again, we're not going into every detail of chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12 and all the different wars and the different places. But what we can say is, one could ask the question, well, Eretz Canaan is relatively small area. How did you have 31 different kings here? So what we have to understand is, in those days, every city was like its own kingdom. They had their own king, they had their own laws, their own ways, their own family, extended families, their own culture. And each little segment of Eretz Canaan was ruled by a different king. So here you hear 31 kings. It sounds like he conquered half the world. It's all in Eretz Israel and Eretz Canaan. So what's interesting here is the way that it appears in the book of Yehoshua. So I'm going to show you here. It goes through it says Melech Yericho. That was the first one, Jericho. And then it goes Melech Ai, the king of Ai. These are the two that we spent a long time discussing, the defeat of Jericho and Ai. But I want to show you how it's arranged in the book of Yehoshua. In other words, it's written what is called a shira. In other words, it's written as like in a different way than the text is usually written. And at the end, on one side are the names of the king and which city they were from. And then across from it is the word echad. So you have a king, echad, another king, echad, onwards. And so this is a very, very unusual kind of way that these 31 kings are written. So it's explained that there are 4 places. There are 4 places that have a different alignment of how they are written. And I just realized I have it marked out in a book and I have to go get it. I'm sorry, give me half a minute. Okay, so it's brought down that there are 4 different places where the form of it's called a shira, a song, but it really means more like a poem. And so one of them is Shira Tayam, the song of the sea. And again, it's written in a different kind of way. You can see it here. It's like when we think of poetry, especially modern poetry, so you can get an idea of what it looks like in an ancient way. The rest of the Torah is not written like this. It's written more like prose and paragraphs, what we would call paragraphs. So we have in the book of Yehoshua, we have Shira Tayam, and then we have Shirat Ha'azinu. Shirat Ha'azinu also is written like we might think of poetry. And I'm not just in a book, we're talking about in the Torah scroll, it's written like this. And then the last place of the 4 is in Megillat Esther. In Megillat Esther, towards the end, it talks about the 10 sons of Haman that were hung. And so this is what it looks like in a Megillah. You can see the rest of it is written like prose, but here it has the name of each of the sons. It has the name and then it says Ve'et, and the next son, and the next son, and. So these are the 4 that are brought down, but it's not just these 4. For example, the 10 Commandments are also part of the 10 Commandments are also written with spaces between them, similar to this. And also, if you remember in the book of Yehoshua, we discussed this, where they went to the 2 mountains of Grizim and Eval and pronounced the blessing and the curse. And so this is how it's written in the Torah also, not in your usual prose way, but in a more, again, we'll call it a poetic way, in a more poetic way. So that's just a very interesting idea here, but it's somewhat mysterious as to the name of the king, and then it says Echad. The name of a king, Echad. Now there's one king, one king, one king, one king. Numerically, the number 31 reversed is 13. 13 equals Echad. So here, like numerically, it was called like instead of a play on words, it's a play on numbers. That each one of these, now, and a simple understanding, what it's pointing out is what I tried to explain before, that each one of these kings, each one of these cities that they defeated was like a world in itself. So you had all of these different kings in a small area, very, very small. Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan, And yet you had 31 different kings, and each one, like I said, they had it was like a whole world to itself. Okay. So this is the review of chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. And I just want to mention already, we're halfway through the book of Yehoshua. I think this is our fourth class. But from the 13th chapter to the end, we're going to do in 1 or 2 weeks, because almost the entire rest of the book of Yehoshua is after he has defeated these 31 kings. Then, first of all, God makes it clear to him that you haven't defeated all of the kings. And in truth, Yehoshua never defeated or conquered all of Eretz Yisrael. He was never successful in doing that, especially Gaza, because that's where the Philistines lived. And the Philistines were a constant threat and a constant enemy. And we'll see it throughout the book of Judges, the book of Shmuel, Samuel, the life of King David HaMelech. The Philistines were always a main enemy. And it's no coincidence that till this day that we are fighting once again in Gaza. Once again. So from chapter 13 to the end, chapter 24 is almost all about the division of the land. Once Yehoshua had conquered a good part of Eretz Yisrael, then the establishment of which tribes would be in which places and by families began. And most of the rest of the book of Yehoshua is explaining this in great detail. So that is what's coming up, and we are going to do that relatively quickly. When we get to the book of Shoftim, Judges, there's not much that can be skipped, because every incident in the book of Judges is worthy of much discussion. And the same thing with the books of Shmuel and Malachim. But the last part of Yehoshua is very detailed about which tribes got which parts of the land. We will review the important parts of it, but in general, we will go through it fairly quickly. So let's go back now to Yehoshua stopping the sun. Okay, there's a lot to discuss here. I'm not even sure if we'll finish tonight, but we'll start. So first of all, it says in the Gemara that 3 people stopped the sun. 3 people were able to stop the sun. The only one that we have a written account of is here in the book of Yehoshua. We read the 3 verses. It doesn't explain how it happened. It explained why it happened. Israel was chasing these 5 kings and their armies, and apparently Yehoshua saw that the day was not long enough, and if night would come, the armies would slip away. And Yehoshua very much wanted to defeat them, because this is the first time that a whole group of kings and armies got together. So it's very important for Israel to be able to defeat them. And so here it explains, even though it's just a few verses, how he stopped the sun and the moon. It says for an entire day. We'll see that there's different opinions as to how many hours exactly the sun stopped. But that's the only one that is explicit. So the question is, who are the other two? And so the Gemara explains one of them is Moshe. When did that happen? When we fought Amalek. And if you remember the story, and it has to do with Yehoshua, is right after we came out of Egypt, Amalek attacked us, even before we got to Har Sinai. They attacked us from the rear, as it says, the ones that were straggling behind and the weaker elements, that's who they attacked. And Moshe appointed Yehoshua to lead the war against Amalek. It was actually, at that point, it was a totally defensive war. And if you remember, Moshe went up onto the mountain and he lifted his hands in prayer. And the Torah says when his hands were raised, Israel would be defeating Amalek. But when he let his hands down, Amalek would start to be victorious. And so his hands became very heavy. And so Yehoshua and Hur on his two sides helped hold up his hands. And they were able to defeat Amalek. So the Gemara says, though, that in order to do that, Moshe stopped the sun. Very, very similar, had to do with a war. And in order to be able to win the war, Moshe stopped the sun. And so that is the second. And the third one is a very, very interesting story. And it's told in the Gemara. And it's about a very, very rich person called Nakdimon ben Gurion. And that's where the name Ben Gurion comes from, the first prime minister of Israel. His name was Nakdimon ben Gurion. So the story is, it was Sukkot time, and it was what's called Aliyat Regel. It was a gathering of Jews from all over the world, a pilgrimage holiday. And by Sukkot time, it hasn't rained in 6 months. And so the wells all around Jerusalem were empty. And there was just hundreds of thousands of people in Jerusalem, as it was every Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And there were no wells. But apparently the Romans at the time, they had wells of water. And so Nakdimon ben Gurion went to one of the leaders and said, I'll buy the water from you and I'll return it right after the holiday. I'll return the water to you. And if not, I will pay you a huge amount of money. And so he gave him the water. And with that water, all of the people of Jerusalem were able to drink. The holiday ends, and he has to pay up now. It was a huge amount of money that he had promised to pay back. He either has to pay back with water or with money. And so on the morning of the day that he had promised to bring it back, this leader sends a message to Naktimon saying, today's the day, get your money ready. And Naktimon sent back a message, it's not the end of the day yet. And the hours go by, and he was hoping that there would be rain. That's the whole thing. He was hoping there would be rain that would fill up the cisterns, and he'd be able to pay back in water. But the rains hadn't come. And so it's getting towards the end of the day. And so Naktimon goes to the temple, and he prays a prayer. And he basically says, Master of the world, what I did was not for my own glory. I did it for your honor. All these Jews had come from all over to celebrate and to acknowledge your mitzvot. I did it for your honor. And now I have just a few hours to pay back, and please send the rain. And so it's almost at the end of the day, and a torrent of rain comes, and within a short time fills up all of the cisterns, and he's able to pay back in water and not this enormous amount of money. So he goes to him and it says, you have your water. All the cisterns are now full. And he said, well, that's very nice, but the day is over. It didn't come in time. The sun is set, the day is over. And so Naktimon goes back to the temple and says, Ribbona Sha'olam, again, I did this for your glory. Please help me out here. And so what happened was that because of the rains, it was cloudy, but it appeared that the sun really had set. But we're told in the Gemara, a miracle occurred and the sun didn't set. It stayed in its place long enough for him to go back, and the clouds parted, and he could see that the sun was still in the sky. So this is a story told in the Gemara. These are the three people that the sun stopped for. So I can see we're towards the end of the class now. So that's what we're going to pick up next week. But I'll just mention that there is a difference between these three. In two of the cases, God made a miracle for Moshe, because it doesn't say that Moshe commanded the sun to stay in the sky and the moon to stand still. God made a miracle for Moshe, and he made a miracle for Naktimon ben Gurion. But here in the verses that we read, it's Yehoshua is commanding the sun and the moon. And I should add, according to all the commentaries, it wasn't just the sun and the moon. It was all the stars also. In other words, if the sun and the moon, if we could imagine stopping, well, what happens to the rest of the cosmos? So we're told that everything stood still. Everything stood still. And the difference was, though, here, Yehoshua was commanding them. So there's much to say, but we'll just do a little bit. why does it say there was no day like this before or after? Because here we heard that for two other people it stopped, and actually in either the Gemara or the Midrash, a fourth case is brought that at the time of Chizkiyahu, Chizkiyahu was from the house of David, from King David, and this is when the Assyrians came and they took the 10 tribes away, and then they tried to conquer Jerusalem, and they had Jerusalem completely surrounded, and a great miracle happened that it's not clear what it was, most likely like a plague, that the morning came and the whole army was dead. The whole army. And then there was another incident, and actually it says in the Gemara that Chizkiyahu, he was on the level to be Mashiach, and that this miracle that occurred, in a sense, could have ushered in the Messianic era. It was such an astounding miracle that had happened, and Chizkiyahu was on a very, very high spiritual level. But they say, why didn't he become Mashiach? Because he didn't sing a song. Like Moshe and Bnei Yisrael, after the Reed Sea split, we sang the Song of the Sea. And different people, when Devorah won her battle against Sisera, so she sang a song. And so they said, Chizkiyahu, had he sang a song, composed a song for the great miracle that had happened, he could have been the Mashiach. In potential, he had it within him to be the Mashiach. So that's one of, I'm sorry. And so what happened later is, for a different reason, Yeshayahu, the prophet Isaiah, comes to Chizkiyahu and says, prepare yourself to die because you are about to die. For what reason? This is a very, very paradoxical, mysterious, perplexing idea here. Why was he about to die? Is because he didn't want to have children. Why didn't he want to have children? Because he saw prophetically that his son would turn out to be very, very evil. He saw this in prophecy. And therefore, he didn't want to give birth to the son. And very perplexing, Yeshayahu says, that's not your concern. You have a mitzvah, the mitzvah to be fruitful and multiply. And it's not for you to determine whether you should or you shouldn't. And so Chizkiyahu said to him, I have a tradition that even if the sword is on your throat, you shouldn't stop asking for salvation, for compassion. So it says, Chizkiyahu turned his face to the wall and he began to pray. And his prayer was so sincere and strong that Isaiah said to him, on the merit of this prayer, God has given you 15 more years of life. What happens, though, is he does have children, and one of them is Manasseh, and he became one of the most evil kings in Jewish history. So it's very paradoxical understanding this whole story. But the reason I said is that there's a tradition that when he was healed and he got 15 more years, that as a sign of like this incredible tshuva that he had done with this prayer, that the sun stood still for him. And that was like a fourth time that's brought down where the sun was stopped. Speaking of stopping, we're going to stop here. And we have a lot more to discuss about this whole incident of Yehoshua stopping the sun. There's some very, very beautiful and deep commentary on what was happening here, but we don't have time tonight. So that's where we'll pick up next week. Okay, as we've been doing this whole year since Rosh Hashanah, we are now going to discuss the Haftorah for Parshat Chayesara. Chayesara is this upcoming Shabbat's Haftorah, and that is what we are going to discuss right now. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's parsha is Chayesara, and the Haftorah comes from the very first chapter and verse in the book of Kings. And as always, the Haftorah follows a theme in the parsha. In our parsha, Sarah passes away, and the beginning of the parsha is the arrangements that Avram made for her burial. This is the whole story of how she's buried in Hebron, in the cave of Machpelah. And so that's the theme of the beginning of the parsha. Later in the parsha, Avram passes away. So here we see the first matriarch and patriarch pass away in this Torah portion. So we would imagine that we would have a similar theme chosen for the Haftorah. And here it is the similar theme, but it's a little bit different because it begins with the words, V'hamelech David Zakein ba b'yamim, that King David became old and he came into days. And the whole Haftorah is, he's basically on his deathbed. He's preparing to die. He was actually very ill at the time. And that's what the Haftorah is about. But we're going to see at the end, there's almost a reversal of the idea of death here. But there's no doubt, and then David does pass away. He's 70 years old. And this is describing his death and his appointing his son Solomon, to become his heir. So the story as told here is that David HaMelech is old and he couldn't get warm. He was just cold all the time. So his advisor said, we should find a young woman who would lay with King David and warm him. And so they find Avishag And she's described as being incredibly beautiful. And she would lie with King David, but it makes it clear he never had relations with her. He's quite literally on his deathbed here. It's imminent. And so to warm him, she would lie in his arms. Now, what's interesting is just last week in the Haftorah, we had the story of Elisha with a great woman who is also called Shulamit. And we learned there that this woman in the previous Haftarah was the sister of Avishag in this parsha. So it's just interesting that the two Haftarahs have two sisters in it. So what happens is like this. David it's apparent to everyone, he's about to pass away. So one of his sons, Adoniyahu, he, on his own initiative, in a sense, coronated himself as king without asking permission. He was handsome, he was charismatic, he was young, he was powerful, and he gathered around him a whole group of people because they see David is about to die, and David has a number of sons. So who is it going to be? So Adoniyahu takes the initiative, and he proclaims, Ani emloch, I will rule. In other words, he appoints himself as the heir to the throne. Now, what's interesting here is that this expression, Ani emloch, is used in Kabbalah to explain the motivation that led to what's called Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. The breaking of the vessels is really the breaking of the vessels of the Sfirot. And each of the Sfirot said, Ani Amloch. In other words, in the Olam HaTohu, in the previous world, a more chaotic world, each of the Sfirot didn't cooperate with the others. Each one said, I will rule. But it's interesting because they take it from Adoniyahu, who on his own decides he's going to be the king. He will be the next in line. And so Kabbalah Chassidut uses this expression, Ani Amloch, I will rule, to express this idea of why the vessels broke. Why was there the breaking of the vessels in the world of Tohu? Because there was no cooperation. Each Sphira said, I can do it by myself. I'm in charge here. And that led to the breaking of the vessels. So what happened is the great prophet at that time was Natan. And he sees what's happening. And he feels that Shlomo, he is supposed to be the next in line because David had promised Bathsheba. Shlomo was the son of Bathsheba and David. David had many wives, but the most important one was Bathsheba, and he had promised her that Shlomo would be his heir. So this Haftorah is explaining how the prophet Natan goes to Bathsheba and says, do you know what's happening here? Is like Adoniyahu is trying to take over. It's a coup. It's a palace coup. And he gives her advice. And he says, you should go to David and you should be honest with him and tell him what's happening and remind him of his promise that Shlomo would be his heir. And when you're doing that, I will come in and I will second your testimony. And that's what happened. Bathsheba went to David and told him, David, you know what's happening here? And then Natan comes and says the same thing. And so David, at that point, gathers his strength and promises Bathsheba, and he tells the prophet, no, Shlomo will rule after me. And that, of course, is what happened. And when the word got out and the prophet attested to the fact that David made it clear that it would be Shlomo, so it turns out that he did become the king. He was 12 years old at the time. Shlomo was 12 years old when he became king. Now, the end of the Haftarah is also a very, very significant verse here. So it says like this. So after David promises Bathsheba, so it says, Vatikod Bathsheba apayim eretz v'tishtachu, that Bathsheba bowed down to David in acknowledgement of his proclamation. And she said, V'tomer Yechi Adoni HaMelech David le'olam, that my master, the king David, he should live forever. And that's how the Haftarah ends. Bathsheba, again, he's on his deathbed, and yet she says, Yechi Adoni HaMelech David le'olam. From this comes the idea of, and all the songs of David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. David, the king of Israel, lives forever. It's not exactly these words, but it's clear that it comes from Bathsheba saying, David, you will live forever. So how do we understand this? So we see that from Shlomo, the kingship of David was extended. When we get to the book of Shmuel, we'll see that God at a certain point came to David and said that your children will be the perpetual kings in Israel. And we know this all the way back to Yaakov's blessing of Yehuda before he dies. And he makes it clear that all the kings will come from Yehuda. And of course, David comes from Yehuda. And Mashiach comes from Yehuda. Mashiach ben David. And so when she says, Yechi Adoni HaMelech David le'olam, she wasn't talking about physically, David, you will live forever. But in a sense, she was saying that your energy, what you began, your kingship will last forever. And so it will. When Mashiach comes, it will be Mashiach ben David, and Bathsheba's words will be fulfilled. So David, Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam, that David, the king of Israel, will live forever. That phrase is included in Kiddush Levana, the sanctification of the moon that we do every month. We say those words. Usually we sing them. David Melech, Melech Yisrael, David Melech, Melech Yisrael, David Melech, Melech Yisrael, Chamai V'Kayam. And so we see that David, in a sense, will live forever. And I'll just end that there's a story in the Gemara that one of the sages say, Yaakov lo met. The patriarch Yaakov never died. So one of the other sages said, what do you mean he never died? It says in the Torah, he died They embalmed him. They buried him. What do you mean he didn't die? And so the sage answers, but are his children still alive? If his children are alive, Yaakov lo met. Yaakov never died. And to this day, we're called Bnei Yisrael. We're called after Yaakov. And so this is the same idea that Bathsheba is proclaiming is, David, you will live forever. You might be about to leave this world in a physical sense, but your neshama and the path that you paved will truly live forever. May we merit to see Mashiach ben David.